Let me tell you something that most species in this galaxy figured out the hard way. You could face a Krethon war beast 9 feet of bone plating and rage, and most soldiers would break. You could face the Velthari minesingers, who could peel your thoughts open like fruit and leave you weeping on the battlefield floor. You could face the Draconist dreadnoughts, ships the size of small moons, bristling with weapons that didn't have names in half the languages spoken between here and the Outer Rim. Most species would negotiate. Most species would run. Most species would send diplomats before they ever sent soldiers, because war, real war, costs something that no civilization wants to pay twice. But then there were humans. And the thing about humans, the thing that nobody understood until it was too late, was that they didn't negotiate because they were afraid. They negotiated because they were polite, the moment that politeness ran out. That's when things got very, very bad for whoever was on the other side. I know because I was there. I was standing in the dust of Karath Station when the 7th Human Special Operations Group walked through a kill zone that 3 Velthari tactical divisions had spent 6 weeks setting up. They walked through it. Not ran, not charged, not stumbled. Walked. And when they came out the other side, the kill zone was gone. The tactical divisions were gone, and the war, a war that had been bleeding the Interstellar Compact for 4 years, was effectively over. I've been trying to find the right words to describe what I saw ever since. I'm still not sure I have them, but let me try. My name is Counselor Adine Voss Mirith of the Tharany Collective. I'm not a soldier. I want to make that clear up front, because what I'm about to describe is a soldier's story, a human soldier's story, and I don't want anyone thinking I have some kind of military romanticism clouding my account. I was a political observer assigned to the Compact's Joint Command on Karath Station. My job was to watch, record, and report. I carried a data slate and a diplomatic credential chip. That was the sum total of my combat power. So when I say I saw what I saw, understand that I was seeing it through the eyes of someone who had spent most of his adult life in council chambers and treaty negotiations. Someone who flinched at loud noises and had never, not once in his 37 years of life, held a weapon. Karath Station was, well, station is almost a joke of a word for it. It had been a station once about 2 centuries ago. A refueling depot at the intersection of 3 major transit lanes on the edge of what humans called the Orion Spur. Back then, it had a crew of maybe 800, a few commercial docking arms, a decent cafeteria, and a view of a very ordinary yellow-orange star that nobody had gotten around to naming properly. 2 centuries of expansion had turned it into something else entirely. By the time the Velthari Ascendancy decided it was the strategic linchpin they needed to sever the Compact's supply lines, Karath Station had grown into something that was half city, half fortress, and entirely impossible to describe to anyone who hadn't seen it. 16 interconnected habitat rings, each one roughly 4 kilometers in diameter. A population of just under 2 million, composed of 37 different species. Docking facilities that could handle everything from single-pilot couriers to heavy cruisers. 3 military command centers, a dozen civilian administrative towers, a sprawling lower sector market district that smelled like 6 different kinds of alien cuisine all at once. And in the outermost ring, sealed behind 3 layers of pressure doors, a garrison of mixed compact forces that had been bleeding slowly for 4 months under Velthari siege. The siege was the word people used, but it wasn't really a siege in the traditional sense. The Velthari didn't surround places and wait. They were too intelligent for that and too patient in a way that was almost predatory. What they did instead was methodical. They identified the pressure points, the communications relays, the power conduits, the supply corridors, and they began dismantling them, one by one. Carefully and precisely, like a surgeon removing organs from a patient they wanted to keep alive just long enough to suffer. They'd taken the outer communications array 6 weeks before I arrived. 2 weeks after that, they'd seized control of the transit corridor that connected Karath Station to the nearest compact supply depot. A week after that, a Velthari commando team had infiltrated the lower sector and done something to the station's primary power routing system that our engineers still hadn't fully diagnosed. Not destroyed it, just modified it. So that every time we tried to reroute power for defensive systems, something else went dark. A habitat ring, a water recycling unit, a medical bay. They weren't trying to break the station. They were trying to break the people inside it. And it was working. I've been on Karath for 11 days when I started to understand just how badly it was working. The civilian population was scared in a way that had moved past panic and settled into something quieter and more corrosive. A dull, grinding dread that you could see in the way people moved through the corridors, never quite making eye contact, never raising their voices above a murmur. The garrison soldiers were exhausted. The kind of exhausted that sleep doesn't fix, because it had been weeks since anyone had slept without one ear open for an alarm. Commander Irulsa of the Tharani Auxiliary was the ranking officer I was supposed to report to. She was a good soldier, smart, experienced, 2 decades of service. When I met her in the command center on my second day aboard, she was studying a tactical hologram of the station, with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that kept changing its pieces. "Counselor," she said, without looking away from the hologram, "welcome to the most strategically significant disaster in the Compact's current operational theater." "That bad?" "Worse." She finally looked at me. Her primary eyes were steady, but her secondary eyes, the smaller pair that Tharani used to express emotional registers they considered too private for full display, were tight with something I recognized as controlled fear. "The Velthari have positioned 3 tactical divisions in the approach corridors. Here, here, and here." She touched the hologram, and orange markers bloomed at 3 points surrounding the station's main access vectors. "They're not attacking, they're waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For the 14th Compact Fleet to attempt a relief mission. When the fleet enters the approach corridor, the Velthari will use us, the station, as leverage. Either the fleet stands down and the Compact cedes the transit rights thereafter, or the Velthari demonstrate their willingness to be unpleasant." She said the last word with a flatness that made it sound much heavier than it should have. "Our analysts believe the demonstration would involve the habitat rings, starting with the ones with the highest civilian density." I stood there for a moment, processing that. "So we're bait," I said. "The diplomatic term is strategic asset," she said, "but yes, bait." She turned back to the hologram. I noticed then something I hadn't caught at first, a 4th set of markers on the display, rendered in a different color. Not orange like the Velthari positions, not blue like the Compact garrison markers. These were rendered in a deep, almost bloody red, and they were positioned in the outermost approach corridor, about 2 hours away from the station at standard deceleration. "What's that?" I asked, pointing. Commander Irulsa was quiet for a moment that lasted just slightly too long. "That," she finally said, "is why I'm still sleeping at night, barely. But still, I don't understand." She turned to look at me fully then, both sets of eyes, and there was something in her expression that I hadn't seen in a Tharani officer's face before. Not quite respect, not quite fear, something that lived in between those two things in the space where certainty used to be. "The Compact didn't just send the 14th Fleet," she said. 3 days ago, High Command attached a support element to the relief mission, a human support element." She touched the red markers. "The 7th Human Special Operations Group," she said. 41 soldiers." I looked at the markers, then at the Velthari positions, then back at the markers. 41, I repeated, "against 3 tactical divisions." "Against 3 tactical divisions," she confirmed. "How many soldiers are in a Velthari tactical division?" "Roughly 800, fully equipped, with drone support, fortified positions, and 6 weeks to prepare the approach corridors exactly the way they want them." The math was not comforting. "That's 2,400 soldiers," I said, "against 41. "Yes, and you're sleeping at night because of that." Commander Irulsa turned back to her hologram. She was quiet for another moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had something in it that I'd describe, years later in my reports, as reverence. Reluctant, slightly disbelieving reverence. "I've seen the files on the 7th, she said. "I've read the after-action reports from every engagement they've been involved in since humanity joined the Compact. I've cross-referenced those reports with casualty data, tactical analyses, and first-hand accounts from officers of 6 different species who have operated alongside them." She paused. "And I still don't entirely believe what I've read. But the numbers don't lie, Counselor. And the numbers say that if anyone is going to walk through what the Velthari have built in those corridors and come out the other side." She left the sentence unfinished. I stared at those red markers and tried to imagine what 41 beings capable of doing that would even look like. I found out about 18 hours later. They came in on a compact assault shuttle, a battered, dark-hulled thing with a nose that looked like it had been repaired 4 or 5 times, and a heat signature that the Velthari sensor net apparently flagged and immediately lost again, which I was told later was not an accident. The shuttle docked at Berth 7 in the military sector, and I happened to be in the command center when Commander Iril Sa got word of their arrival. "I'd like to observe their briefing," I said. She looked at me sideways. "That's irregular," she said. "So is everything else about this situation," I said. She considered that for a moment, then made a small gesture with her upper hand that meant something like "fine, but I'm not responsible for how you feel about it afterward." We walked down together. Berth 7 was a wide, utilitarian space, gray metal walls, fluorescent strips overhead, the faint smell of lubricant and recycled air that every military docking bay in the galaxy seems to share regardless of who built it. There were a handful of station crews standing off to the sides, officially there to handle the docking protocols and logistics. Unofficially, they were there to look. Word had gotten around fast. It always does on a station under siege. Information moves like water, finding every crack and gap and pooling in corners. People knew a human special forces unit was arriving. I could see it in the way the station crew were standing. A little too still, a little too carefully casual, the way people stand when they're trying not to let on how much attention they're paying. The shuttle's boarding ramp descended with a hydraulic hiss. They came out in a single file line, and the first thing I thought, the very first thing before anything else, was that they were smaller than I expected. This is embarrassing to admit because I'd reviewed the files. I knew the average human dimensions. I knew that humans were, by galactic standards, medium-sized, taller than Velthari but shorter than Crethon, broader than Tharani but lighter than most species with similar body mass. I knew all of this intellectually. But there's something about expectation, about build-up, about the fact that you've heard stories, that you've read reports that describe things that shouldn't be physically possible, that creates a version in your mind. Something larger. Something that looks different from the rest of the universe. These looked like people. They wore armor, yes. Dark tactical plates, matte finished to kill reflections, fitted close to the body in a way that spoke of purpose over display. They carried weapons I didn't have names for, compact, severe-looking things that had been modified and remodified until they barely resembled their original manufacture. They had packs on their backs and smaller packs at their thighs and gear attached to their chests and forearms that I couldn't fully identify. They moved in a way that was quiet and efficient and didn't waste anything. But they looked like people, not monsters, not giants, not the terrifying weapons that their reputation suggested. There was a woman at the front of the line. I realized later she was their commanding officer, Major Sira Kovac. She was of medium height with dark hair cut short on the sides and a face that you'd call ordinary in any other context. The kind of face you'd see in a market district and not look twice at, except for her eyes. I noticed her eyes immediately, and I couldn't entirely explain why. They were dark and they were calm, and they were moving constantly, taking in the berth, the crew, the environmental details, but without any apparent urgency. The way a person looks around a room when they're comfortable in every room they've ever been in. She saw Commander Iril Sa and walked toward her without any particular hurry. "Commander," she said. Her voice was lower than I'd expected. "Major Kovac, 7th SOG, thanks for having us." "Major," Iril Sa did a small formal nod, a Tharani gesture of significant respect that most non-Tharani wouldn't recognize. "Your arrival is appreciated." "We aim to please." There was a slight dryness in it, not quite humor, not quite irony. Something worn smooth, like a phrase she'd said so many times it had its own kind of ritual meaning. "We'll need a space to do our mission overview, access to your current tactical data on the Velthari positions," and she paused briefly, and her eyes flicked to me. "And I'm guessing that's Counselor Voss Mirith." I straightened slightly. "Yes, I'm the Compact's political observer, I know." She looked at me for just a moment, that steady, constantly scanning gaze. "You're welcome to sit in on the briefing if that's useful for your documentation. As long as you understand that if I ask you to leave at any point, you leave immediately and without discussion." "Of course," I said. She nodded once and turned back to Iril Sa. "Lead the way." Behind her, 40 soldiers filed off the shuttle in that same quiet, efficient column. A few of them glanced at me as they passed. One, a tall man with a jaw that looked like it had been hewn from something harder than bone, caught my eye and gave me a very small, very brief nod. Like an acknowledgement. Like I see you there, civilian, welcome to the interesting part. I found out later his name was Sergeant First Class Tomas Reinhold. He was the one who went into the secondary command node alone, in the dark, and brought the station's power routing back online 6 hours before the main engagement began. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Build tension. The briefing room they gave us was on the mid-level of the military sector. A rectangular space with a long table, tactical display screens on 3 walls, and air that was a few degrees cooler than comfortable because the environmental system in that section was apparently one of the things the Velthari had messed with. Major Kovac didn't sit down. She stood at the end of the table and looked at the tactical display that Irulsa's team pulled up, the full picture, all positions, all markers, and she was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I started to feel the quiet as something physical, like pressure. Her soldiers were arrayed around the table and the walls. Some were sitting, a few were standing, 2 were looking at their own personal displays. One, a compact, dark-skinned woman with the practiced stillness of someone who spent a lot of time waiting, had her eyes closed and appeared to be breathing deliberately as though conserving something. Nobody was talking. Nobody looked nervous. That was the thing I kept coming back to. Nobody looked nervous. I was nervous enough for everyone in the room. 3 divisions, Kovac finally said. Corridor Alpha, Corridor Beta, and the crossover junction at point 77. She pointed at the display without touching it, just a gesture in the air. This one, she indicated the Velthari position in Corridor Alpha, is the anchor. The other 2 are reactive. They'll redirect based on what the anchor position reports. If we take the anchor out first, the others lose their coordination architecture. The anchor position is the most heavily fortified, Irulsa said. It sits at a natural choke point where the corridor narrows. They've had 6 weeks. Our intelligence suggests multiple defensive layers, drone screens, hardened cover positions, probably Mine Singer support. Mine Singers, one of Kovac's soldiers said. He was young-looking. Humans always looked young to me until you looked at their eyes, and this one's eyes were old. And his name, I later learned, was Corporal Dev Anand. How many? 2 confirmed, possibly 4. A slight reaction passed through the room. Not fear exactly. More like the focused attention that predators give to something worth respecting. Velthari Minesingers were the reason most species negotiated before sending soldiers. The Velthari were already formidable in conventional combat, smaller than humans, but faster and nearly impossible to ambush, with a tactical instinct that seemed almost preternaturally good. But the Minesingers were something else. They were rare even among Velthari. Maybe 1 in 10,000 had the neurological architecture for it. But when they were present on a battlefield, they could read the surface thoughts of nearby combatants, anticipate actions before they happened, plant confusion and doubt, and panic directly into enemy minds. Fighting Velthari without Minesingers was hard. Fighting them with Minesingers was something that most tactical databases categorized, flatly and without elaboration, as not recommended. 4 Minesingers and 800 troops at the anchor position, Anand said. That's going to be a fun morning. And then something happened that I still think about. He smiled. Not a grim smile. Not a this is going to be terrible smile. A genuine, slightly crooked, almost warm smile, like someone who just found out there was going to be a challenge worth getting out of bed for. The woman with her eyes closed, Sergeant Unipark, I eventually learned, opened them just slightly and said, without inflection, "You say that every time and it's never actually a fun morning." "It's fun in retrospect," Anand said. "That's not what fun means." "Sure it is." The exchange lasted maybe 6 seconds. Nobody laughed, but the atmosphere in the room shifted just slightly in a direction I couldn't entirely name. Lighter, maybe, or more grounded, like the conversation had anchored everyone to something real. Kovac let it run its course, and then continued as though it hadn't happened. "We're not taking the anchor position by force," she said. "At least not the way the Velthari expect a force assault to work." She turned to a soldier near the tactical display, a broad-shouldered woman with a scar running along her left cheekbone, who I would learn was the team's technical specialist, Staff Sergeant Marta Oyalaran. "Marta, run the thing." "Running the thing," Oilaran confirmed, tapping her display. The tactical hologram shifted. The Velthari positions remained, but a new overlay appeared, a schematic of the corridor architecture around Corridor Alpha. Maintenance shafts, power conduits, environmental system access points, structural weak spots flagged in yellow. This station's been growing for 200 years, Kovac said. That means 200 years of additions, modifications, expansion projects, and structural improvisation. The Velthari have been studying the obvious tactical geography. They've spent 6 weeks building their positions based on the corridors and access points that appear in the official station schematics. She touched the display, bringing up a section of the schematic that looked different from the rest. Older, rougher, the kind of thing that had been added to a system long after the system was designed. They haven't been studying the unofficial geography. Irolsa leaned forward. Maintenance tunnels from the first expansion phase, those were decommissioned. Decommissioned doesn't mean sealed, Kovac said. Oilaran. Sealed at the access points visible in the current schematics, Oilaran confirmed. Not sealed at 3 secondary junction points that appear in the original construction records from 214 years ago. The Velthari don't have those records. We do. Your engineering team was very helpful. Irolsa looked at the display for a moment. You're going to go through the walls, she said, quietly. Through the walls, along the walls, and above the anchor position, Kovac said. We'll be in the corridor infrastructure before any of their sensor systems can pick us up because the sensor systems are calibrated for the current station layout. They're not looking at 200-year-old maintenance shafts. She paused. Then we're going to remove the anchor. The other 2 positions will take approximately 12 minutes to re-establish independent coordination protocols after the anchor falls. In those 12 minutes, the 14th Fleet's advance elements come in hard through corridors Beta and Gamma. The 2 positions are caught between the fleet and our teams, and the Velthari's tactical architecture in this sector collapses. The room was quiet for a moment. The Mind Singers, Irolsa said, if they detect you in the infrastructure. They read surface thoughts, Kovac said, so we think about the right things. Another pause. I'm not sure I understand, I said. I'd been silent until this point, just listening, but this I could not ask. How do you control what you're thinking? Everyone in the room looked at me, not unkindly. More like I'd asked a question. They'd all stopped bothering to explain a long time ago. Kovac looked at me for a moment. Practice, she said, lots of it. That was all she said about it. But later, after everything, when I was writing my reports and trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed, I went back to that word and turned it over and over. Practice. Not some technological solution, not a countermeasure or a piece of equipment. Practice. The deliberate, grinding, patient human habit of training themselves until the thing that was being trained became something closer to reflex than to thought. They had trained themselves, apparently, to control what they thought about well enough to fool something that could read minds. I've had a long career studying many species. I've sat across treaty tables from Velthari ambassadors and Crethon warlords and beings whose biology was so different from mine that we needed 3 interpreters between us. I've seen things I didn't have language for. The idea of training yourself to fool a mind reader still strikes me as one of the most audacious things any species has ever decided to try. And these 41 people had apparently made it routine. I didn't sleep. I don't think many people on the station slept that night, though for most of the civilian population the reason was the ongoing dread of the siege, not the specific knowledge that 41 humans were about to walk into something that should, by any reasonable calculation, kill them. I spent the hours in the military sector, half because I had nothing useful to do elsewhere and half because I didn't want to be away from the information when it started. I sat in the command center with Commander Irolsa and a rotating cast of her staff officers, watching the tactical displays, drinking a hot beverage that tasted like someone had tried to approximate tea from memory and gotten it about 60% right. Around the 3rd hour, I went for a walk, not for any particular reason, just because sitting still was making the dread worse. I found Sergeant First Class Reinhold in one of the side corridors off the military sector, sitting on an equipment case with his back against the wall, cleaning what I assumed was part of his weapon. The components were spread across a cloth on the floor in front of him, with a precision that suggested this was something he'd done so many times it had become almost meditative. He looked up when I approached and gave me that same small nod he'd offered in the docking bay. "Counselor," he said. "Sergeant," I hesitated. "Do you mind if I—" He gestured at the equipment case beside him. I sat. For a while we were both quiet. He kept working on his weapon, methodical, focused, each small piece handled and checked and set back in its exact place. I watched the corridor and tried not to think too specifically about the morning. "Can I ask you something?" I said after a while. "Sure," he said without looking up. "Are you afraid?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the kind of quiet that means someone doesn't want to answer. The kind of quiet that means someone is actually thinking about the question. "Yeah," he said, "a little." "That surprises me," I said. Then I realized how that sounded. "I'm sorry, I don't mean." "No, I know what you mean." He set down the piece he was working on and looked at it. "You mean that from the outside we don't look afraid. And yeah, that's true, we don't show it the same way. Because we've been trained not to, because showing it at the wrong moment gets people killed." He picked up the piece again. "But feeling it is different. I think anybody who goes into something like tomorrow without feeling anything is either lying or broken." I considered that. "Then what do you do with it?" I asked. "The fear." He thought about it again. That deliberate, unrushed quality to his thinking, like someone who had decided a long time ago that quick answers were usually worse than true ones. "You make it small," he said. "You don't pretend it's not there because it is there, and pretending doesn't work. But you look at all the other things that are also there. You think about the training. You think about the people next to you. You think about the specific problem in front of you, not the whole thing, just the next piece of it. The fear gets small because you put enough other things next to it." He paused. "And then you move, because movement is what you've got." I sat with that for a while. "The mind singers," I said eventually. "If they can read your surface thoughts." "They read what's on top," he said. "If you give them enough noise on the surface, enough immediate task-focused information, they can't get to the stuff underneath. It's like," he thought for a moment. "You know how on a deep-water world, if you put enough debris on the surface of the water, you can't see what's below? Same thing. And you can actually maintain that, under fire." He smiled, not the young corporal's warm smile from the briefing room, something quieter and more worn. "Under fire, it's actually easier," he said. "When the shooting starts, staying task-focused is survival. It's the before that's hard. The waiting, that's where discipline lives." He went back to his weapon. I stayed until he'd finished reassembling it, and then I went back to the command center and I sat, and I waited. I didn't see them go. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no moment of significant departure. One moment the tactical display showed their marker, rendered in red in the military sector staging area. The next moment it was moving, slowly and steadily, toward the outer sectors. And then it was gone, because they'd entered the infrastructure of the station itself, and the sensors couldn't track them anymore. The command center became very quiet. Commander Irulsa stood at the main display and watched the Velthari positions with the focused stillness of someone who decided that if she looked away, something would change. Time passed, the tactical display was still. The Velthari positions didn't shift. The red marker that had been the 7th SOG was gone, replaced by nothing, by the blank institutional green of a display that had nothing to show. I thought, they're in the walls. They're moving through a 200-year-old corridor that no one has walked in decades in the dark, with everything switched off and no signals to give them away. And somewhere in the direction they're heading there are 2,400 enemy soldiers and at least 2 beings who can read minds. I thought, they're thinking about the right things. "Contact," said the communications officer. Her voice was very level. "Velthari anchor position is reporting. They're reporting a breach." A pause. "They've engaged." "Multiple point contacts, corridor interior." Another pause, shorter. "Anchor command frequency has gone," she stopped. "Anchor command frequency has gone silent." The room held a kind of suspended breath. "Time mark," Irulsa said quietly. 05:21:14, someone confirmed. "Notify the 14th Fleet. 12-minute window begins now." Then the communications officer said something I've never forgotten, and I've been in this business long enough to have heard a lot of things. "We're getting telemetry from inside the anchor position," she said. Her voice had changed, still level, but something had come into it. Something like disbelief that had been carefully controlled but not quite completely. "Ma'am, the 7th is they're not pulling back after the initial breach. They're pushing through." "Through the anchor position?" Irulsa said. "Through and past it. They've breached the anchor, they're leaving a team to hold the position, and the rest of the unit is advancing into Corridor Beta." The 12-minute window hadn't closed yet. They were already moving to the next position. I want to be careful about how I describe the next period of time, because I was in a command center watching telemetry data and tactical readouts, not in those corridors. I didn't see what happened. What I know is filtered through data points and the accounts of the people who were there. But let me tell you what the data showed, and let me tell you what the people said later, and let me let you form your own picture. The 7th SOG hit the anchor position at 5:21. As best the analysis later reconstructed, they came from 3 directions simultaneously: above through the old maintenance shafts, from the sides through structural access points that the Velthari hadn't sealed, and through the main corridor approach using movement patterns and cover discipline so tight that by the time the Velthari drone screen registered them as a threat, they were already inside the perimeter. The Mind Singers, there were 4 of them, our intelligence had underestimated, attempted to disrupt the humans' coordination by seeding confusion and panic into their surface thoughts. What the Mind Singers apparently found in those surface thoughts was not confusion and not panic. A Velthari field commander who survived and was later interviewed described it as follows. I'm translating loosely from the diplomatic transcript. "We pushed against their minds and found nothing we could use. Not blankness, not barriers. Focus. Extremely specific, extremely detailed operational focus. I have faced many species in combat. I have used my talents against many minds. I have never encountered a species that in the middle of a firefight thinks less about the firing and more about the geometry. They were calculating angles. They were tracking positions of their companions. They were thinking about their next 3 physical actions in explicit step-by-step sequence. There was no fear, no rage, no survival reflex, nothing with emotional content for me to amplify or redirect. It was like trying to throw someone off balance when they have no center of gravity for you to find." That account was given 6 months later in a compact intelligence debrief. The commander had surrendered at 6:03. But here is the moment I want to tell you about, because this is the moment that I actually saw, not from data but with my own eyes. At 6:17, a notification came through. A civilian access corridor in Ring 9, the innermost civilian habitat ring, had been compromised. A splinter element of the Velthari 3rd Division, apparently separated from their command structure when the 7th disrupted the coordination network, had broken through a secondary access point and were moving into a civilian zone. The garrison was stretched. The 14th Fleet's advance units were engaged with what remained of the first 2 Velthari divisions. There were maybe 600 Velthari soldiers in that splinter group, and the only compact forces close enough to respond in time were. The command center notification went out. And then on the tactical display, the red marker, the 7th SOG's marker, now back in the tracking range because they'd cleared enough sensor nodes to show up, moved. Not toward extraction, not toward a safe position, not toward any of the logical next locations for a unit that had just fought continuously for almost an hour through a fortified position, and then into a second fortified position. It moved toward Ring 9, toward the civilian zone, toward the 600 soldiers. Irulsa saw it at the same moment I did. She made a sound I'd never heard a Tharani officer make before, a sharp, involuntary exhalation of something that was half relief and half something like awe. "They're already moving," she said, not to me, not to anyone, just an observation to the room. I left the command center. I don't have a perfect explanation for why. Part of me recognized that what I was about to do was not sensible behavior for a diplomatic observer in a military situation. But I'd been watching data for hours, and something in me needed to actually see rather than just interpret, and my feet were moving before my better judgment caught up. I got to the transit hub in Ring 9, the wide, open connection point between the civilian residential sections, at 6:31. 14 minutes after I left the command center, running parts of the way and walking fast the rest. I heard them before I saw them. Not the humans were quiet in a way that still unsettles me when I think about it. I heard the Velthari splinter group. The sounds of their approach through the outer corridors, the specific acoustic signature of their movement, the high-pitched directional clicks they used for squad coordination, echoing off the metal walls and ceiling and floor. And then from the other end of the hub I heard nothing. No clicks, no boots, no armor, just nothing. And then the 7th SOG was there. They came into the hub from 4 access points simultaneously, the 2 main corridor entrances and 2 secondary access points that I hadn't even registered as things a person could move through. They spread out across the space with a fluid, contained efficiency that looked almost choreographed, except that it clearly wasn't, because there was too much environmental adaptation, too much immediate response to the specific geometry of this room at this moment for it to be any kind of script. Major Kovac was in the center of the formation, and she had a cut on her face, above the right cheekbone, already dried, and a burn mark on her left forearm that had damaged the armor plate there. She didn't seem to be accounting for either of these things. Her eyes were doing their constant quiet scan. The Velthari splinter group came around the corner of the east corridor. I watched. What happened next took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because the timestamp data was in the official record later. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. 600 Velthari soldiers, separated from their command structure, but still armed and still moving as a coherent tactical unit, against the remaining active elements of the 7th SOG, which at this point, accounting for the team left to hold the anchor position, and 2 soldiers who'd taken serious wounds in the corridor beta engagement, was 31 people. I'm not going to try to describe the specific tactics, because I didn't have the training to follow them fully in the moment, and the reconstructions I read afterwards still don't translate well into ordinary language. What I can tell you is what it looked like from where I was standing at the edge of the hub with my back to a wall and my hands doing something they were doing apparently without my conscious input, pressed flat against the surface behind me, as though trying to become part of it. It looked like water moving through a space. The humans moved through the hub and through the Velthari formation like something fluid, finding the spaces between, redirecting, never static, never clustered. There was no line. There was no defensive position. There was constant, purposeful, flowing motion that made the Velthari's attempts to establish fire lanes and covered positions into problems that had no solutions, because every solution they reached for had already been taken away. The Velthari were well trained. They adapted. They tried 3 or 4 different coordination approaches in those 3 minutes. I could see them shifting and regrouping and redirecting. Any of those approaches against most opponents would have worked. None of them worked here. At 6:34, the Velthari field commander in the splinter group transmitted a surrender request on the compact emergency channel. Major Kovac acknowledged it in standard Velthari formal dialect, correctly, with the appropriate honorific construction, which I was later told she'd spent 6 months learning specifically because she'd been advised Velthari commanders responded better to proper form and ordered a ceasefire. Her soldiers stopped firing. Immediately, all of them, simultaneously. The hub went quiet. The Velthari soldiers, slowly and carefully, began to set down their weapons. And I realized that I was holding my breath and had been for some time, and I let it out. And the sound of my own exhale in the suddenly quiet space was embarrassingly loud. Reinhold, tall, jaw like carved stone, walked past me a moment later. He glanced at me with an expression that I would describe, maybe, as knowing. Like he'd expected to find me there or something like me there, a witness. He looked like he'd been through something, but he was walking steadily and his eyes were clear. "Counselor," he said. "Sergeant," I managed. He walked past me and disappeared around a corridor bend, and I stood in the transit hub of Ring 9 and watched Velthari soldiers lay down their arms while 31 humans, tired, marked up, moving like people who'd been through the kind of mourning that should have broken them, secured the space with quiet professional efficiency. The official announcement of Velthari withdrawal from the Karath Station Theater came through diplomatic channels at 1847 that same evening. It was framed, in the formal language of interstellar diplomacy, as a recalibration of strategic objectives pending further negotiation. That's the kind of phrase that means. We underestimated something and we'd like to stop before we underestimate it further. The Ascendancy's primary negotiator, a senior diplomat named Vel Soras who had met once before at a compact function, and remembered as someone who chose every word with extraordinary care. Sent a communique to the compact diplomatic corps that, in addition to the formal withdrawal language, contained a single paragraph that I don't think was intended for general circulation, but was included in the record I later received. The paragraph read, in translation, "We had anticipated the arrival of human Special Operations Forces. We had studied their operational history and concluded that the tactical preparation we had implemented would adequately address the threat vector. We were incorrect. We were incorrect not because our preparation was inadequate by the standards we applied, but because the standards we applied were wrong. We modeled human combatants as an extreme version of variables we already understood: faster reaction, higher pain tolerance, greater aggression. We did not model them as a different category of problem. The distinction proved decisive. We will require time to develop an appropriate analytical framework before we consider direct confrontation with human forces again. The current strategic objectives do not merit the cost." I read that paragraph many times. We did not model them as a different category of problem. That, I thought, was perhaps the most honest thing a Velthari diplomat had ever put in writing. In the days after the engagement, I walked around Karath Station and watched the gradual return of something like normalcy. The siege infrastructure was being dismantled, station engineers working alongside compact technical teams to undo what the Velthari had done to the power routing systems. The habitat rings that had been dark were lit again. The market district in the lower sector reopened. You could tell in the way people moved that the dread had lifted, that specific grinding dread that had settled into the station like sediment. People walked faster. They made eye contact. A group of children in Ring 4 were playing some game in a corridor with a ball that kept bouncing off the walls, and one of them laughed, a sharp, bright sound. And I stopped walking and just listened to it for a moment. I found Major Kovac in a small commissary off the military sector on the second day after the engagement. She was eating something, a bowl of something brown and hot-looking, and writing on a data slate with the focused attention she seemed to bring to everything. She was alone. I hesitated at the door, then I went in. "May I asked, indicating the seat across from her. She looked up. Some of the constant motion quality of her attention was quieter now, not gone, just resting. She looked, for the first time since I'd seen her step off that shuttle, like someone who was allowing herself to be off-duty. "Sure," she said. I sat. A station server brought me one of those 60% tea approximations, and I held it and didn't drink it. "I wanted to say thank you," I said. "Inadequate, I know, but—" "You don't have to," she said. "It's the job." "It's more than the job," I said. "What you did, what all of you did, I've been in this work for 17 years. I've seen a lot of things. I haven't seen anything like that." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her food. "How many people on this station?" she asked. "Just under 2 million, I said. "That's the thing," she said. "That's what the job always is. Not the tactics, not the engagement record, not any of the stuff that goes in the official reports. It's—" She paused, and she seemed to be choosing words carefully, the way Reinhold had been careful. 2 million people trying to live their lives. That's what the whole thing is for. Everything else is just the method." I sat with that. "How are your soldiers?" I asked. 15 with injuries, 2 serious there in your medical bay, and I'm told they'll recover." She looked back at her slate. "Everyone's here." "Everyone's here," said simply, with a weight behind it that she didn't elaborate on. I thought about all the mathematics of those corridors, the Velthari tactical divisions, the mine singers, the 600 soldiers in Ring 9, and 41 humans, 39 by the end, accounting for the 2 who'd gone to the medical bay, who had walked into all of it and walked back out. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You don't have to answer." "Ask," she said. "The Velthari minesingers said in the debrief they said they couldn't find anything in your soldiers' minds to disrupt, that you were all focused on operational specifics, angles, positions, task sequences." I looked at her. "Is that true? Were you all genuinely that focused, in the middle of all of that?" She picked up her spoon. "Mostly," she said. "What's the other part? The part that's not task focus?" She thought about it, stirred her food. "You ever have someone you care about?" she said finally. "Not in a dramatic way, just people, friends, team, people you've been through things with." She glanced up at me briefly. You think about them, not strategically, just there in the back of it, underneath the task focus. She looked back down. The mind singers read the surface and found geometry. The surface is what we're trained to put up there, but underneath, she made a small, almost imperceptible gesture. Underneath is the reason, and the reason isn't complicated. She ate. I sat with my tea and thought about 39 people in those corridors and what they had, underneath the angles and the task sequences and the controlled surface of their thoughts. Each other. I've been asked in the years since Karath Station to explain what made the 7th SOG, what makes humans, specifically, in a military context. Different from the other species, the galaxy has fielded in its various conflicts. I've given a lot of answers over the years. Physiological resilience, psychological adaptability, the specific way human courage manifests, not as the absence of fear but as the decision to move despite it. The fact that humans are, uniquely in the galaxy's catalog of spacefaring species, simultaneously one of the most individually fragile beings and one of the most collectively stubborn. The way they train, the way they think. The way they care about each other in a manner that is, somehow, not a weakness, but the engine of everything they're capable of. All of those answers are true, none of them are complete. The most honest answer I've found, the one that feels closest to what I actually understood when I was standing in that transit hub, watching Velthari soldiers lay down their arms, is this. Every other species goes to war because they calculate that they can win. Humans go to war because they've decided there's something that cannot be allowed to lose. It's not the same thing. The difference between those two motivations is the difference between a force that fights until the math changes and a force that fights until the thing they're protecting is safe. The math changes a lot. The thing they're protecting doesn't. And no species, not the Velthari with their mind singers, not the Krethon with their war beasts, not any of the powers in this galaxy who have had the misfortune of finding out the hard way, has ever figured out how to make that stop. I think of Reinhold in that corridor the night before. You make the fear small, and then you move, because movement is what you've got. I think of Kavach in the commissary stirring her food. 2 million people trying to live their lives. That's what the whole thing is for. I think of the sound of that child laughing in Ring 4. I've been studying this galaxy for a long time. I've sat at more tables and read more reports and witnessed more things than I can neatly count. And the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that feels most true about the species that the galaxy has decided, with universal and hard-won agreement, it does not want to fight. They're not the most dangerous thing in the galaxy because of what they can do in a corridor. They're the most dangerous thing in the galaxy because of what's underneath the corridor. Because of what they're fighting for. And the day that stops being enough for them, the day they run out of things worth protecting, will be the day you might start to worry. But until then, they'll keep walking through kill zones. And the rest of the galaxy, wise enough now to know better, will stay out of the way.